Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Welcome to the Discipline of Maths colloquium, it's data science colloquium today as well. It is an absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Kate Helmstedt, who is an associate professor at QUT, and she's the leader of AMEG, the QUT Applied Mathematical Ecology Group. Kate did her PhD at the University of Queensland and did a postdoc for a couple of years at Berkeley in the US, after which she came back to QUT, has been on a DECRA for the last 3 years, and taking over the world by the sounds of it. She has won many awards, including a Queensland Tall Poppy Award, a Rising Star of Science Award, an Academic Altruism Award, which goes to the other great thing about Kate is that, she's just a champion for early career researchers and women in science and an all-round good person. Volunteers for things like Women in Data Science, the Flying Scientists organisation, Girls Who Code. It's been a Choose Math mentor. It's just an all-round excellent person. So it's I think it's safe to say that Kate is no longer a rising star of science, but a true rock star. And it's a pleasure to have her here today to tell us about making better decisions, protect species and ecosystems using maths. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. It's my first time in Adelaide, so I'm really stoked to be here. I was asked today by some of your school contingent, what have I done? Like, what Adelaide sites have I seen? And I said, I've drunk a lot of Adelaide wine. So that's about as far as I've gotten on tourism, but it's great to be here. Yes, okay, so I want to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people as the traditional owners of unceded lands on which I live and work. So both my home and my university sit within Turrbal and Yagara land. I recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning, and I think particularly when we're thinking as data scientists, and for me as someone who works in the field of ecology, it's important for us to realise that there's tens of thousands of years of history in those sciences in Australia, and we're really kind of standing on the shoulders of work that has been done before, and I think it's something that we need to acknowledge and work harder to fold into the work that we do now and forever. Okay, so I work in ecological decision science. My work, the overarching goal of my work is an applied goal. It's not to take a particular field of mathematics and apply it to this, although I do have my expertise is in optimization and operations research, but really I'm driven by these questions about how to kind of stop this rapid and what feels like an irreversible decline of the systems that we rely on so heavily. And in ecological decision science, much like decision science in other types of fields, where we have these restrictions and these complexities that we're used to seeing. So we have limited time, we have limited money, we have limited personnel to try and achieve the goals we want to make. We have these endangered systems and ecosystems and species and processes, and we really heavily rely upon those things. And that need, the things that we get from the environment are growing. As our population grows, we need more from systems at the same time as they're declining and at the same time as we have these limited resources. And so what that means is to manage ecosystems and species, to protect them, there's really difficult decisions. And what that means is that this is a really good opportunity for things like operations research, decision science, optimization, data science, mathematical modeling to come in and like really make a difference on a question that, all of society is relying upon. But ecosystems create a really complex decision-making context. So within ecosystems, and ecosystems are basically like anywhere there's two living things interacting, we can start to think about that as an ecosystem, but of course they can get massive. So we can think about things the size of the Great Barrier Reef, things the size of Antarctica, which is two places that I do work on. So there's really complex interactions in these systems. They're operating in this context of really rapidly changing background environments. Humans can either help these systems or hurt these systems, and I think we do both, but our impacts are really unpredictable. And we're really in this world of really patchy or poor data. So unlike other fields where we're really starting to get into this world of like big data and we have heaps of data and we don't quite know what to do with all of that data, particularly in thinking about like bio and med, in ecology and in these ecosystems, we're still really, really limited. They can go and do tests in some places, but we're getting really poor spatial, that kind of spatial spread of the data, and poor temporal spread of the data, because even if we start today, we don't have these long histories. The other thing that's really complex in these systems is that you can't test the management. So when we're thinking about optimizing management of systems, boy, it would be nice if you could do a little bit of a test and see how it goes. But in these ecosystems, oftentimes it's not very defensible to be able to go in and run an in-person, in-situ test to see if something works or not. And so it's really clear that mathematical modeling kind of has to be the answer in a lot of these systems. So I often am talking to kind of OR or modeling specialists who work in other systems and know other systems really, really well. So I think it's useful to talk about how adding ecology to this makes things a little bit more difficult than the kind of canonical examples that we think about in these systems. So one complexity is that they're always stochastic. We never have a truly deterministic system in ecology. And if we model it as a deterministic system, we know that we're lying to ourselves, but that's okay. We do it, but we know that there's that lie. We're often thinking about sequential decisions, like rarely in environmental systems do you get the luxury of doing something once and then getting benefits in perpetuity. We have really, really high uncertainty, but the levels of uncertainty, how uncertain you are really, really different in different places that seem the same, but also like in different layers of the data. So if I want to know about an ecological system, I want to know about the temperature and the rainfall and the species that are there and things that have happened in the past. And all of those different layers have different levels of uncertainty. And that makes thinking about uncertainty and making decisions under uncertainty that little bit more difficult. We often have partial observability in these kinds of systems. So we can go and sample and we can test and we can predict what might happen or what management might do. But when we're looking at the responses and the reactions, we can only see a little bit of what is there. And we have really competing objectives, and those objectives have different units. So one objective always, I mean, in many of these systems is just a pure wanting to preserve the biodiversity. So let's say you want to maximize the number of species, that's in the unit of species. Someone over here wants to also optimize for jobs and the economy, and that's in dollars. And often when we're thinking about trying to optimize systems, we're like, put it all in the same units, put it all in dollars. But in these types of systems, it's kind of indefensible to try and translate everything into dollars. And so that adds this complexity in comparing between different objectives. There's no like benevolent dictator. So often when we're thinking about optimizing a system, we say, okay, if I had complete control, or the person that has complete control, let's understand the system, choose what they should do, and then they're just going to go and do it. But most actions in ecology or in environmental management, the journey from saying what the optimal decision is through to something happening on the ground is mediated through this really complex policy space. And so it means that even if you tell someone the optimal decision, the chance that happens is like, in some systems, impossible. It's never going to happen, and you've characterized the problem wrong. But we have to be understanding what happens after handing over that recommendation. And there's many actors in the system beyond the point of just being a benevolent dictator who decides to change the system. It's also to enact any changes. It's not just one person or one thing. It's not like the government goes and does something. It's often like you're relying upon kind of people to do stuff, or you're relying on grassroots organizations to do things, and that makes it hard. And that's because there's all these many stakeholders for each applied problem, even in one specific context, and thinking about the Great Barrier Reef in particular, like this breadth of stakeholders, all who need to be considered for one single case study. And the first case study I'm going to talk about is Antarctica. So Antarctica, before I started this research project, I didn't know anything about Antarctica. So I was shocked at how big it is. It's twice the size of Australia. It's right down the bottom of the globe, not knowing how little people already know about it. So assume that's the base level of knowledge. So Antarctica is largely snow and ice. About kind of 2 to 4% of it is bare ground. So about 2 to 4% of it, you can see the rocks underneath and there's no snow and ice there. And that's where biodiversity lives. That's where all of the species are in the continent. So that's where kind of things that we really care about and know a lot about, like penguins live, big observable things. That's also where kind of a lot of seabirds nest in those in those small areas. But then there's also these really small things that people care about in Antarctica, like these tiny, tiny lichen, these little moss that kind of live in patches this big in the context of this thing that's twice the size of Australia. And then there's even smaller things that I had never imagined people would care about, but people really care about these like little springtails and bugs and things that live in this system. So when we're thinking about protecting biodiversity in Antarctica, it can't just be this. It has to be all of them because they're stakeholders that care about all of these things. And this is how the ecosystem works. So we are about 2 years into the funding for an ARC, kind of like a centre of excellence. It's kind of the size of a centre of excellence. It's technically a special research initiative called Securing Antarctica's Environmental Future. And there's it's run out of Monash. There's a big node of it in QUT. There's also a slightly more modest sized node of SAFE here at Adelaide. That I think, makes this interesting for you guys and for your team. And the work that we're doing in SAFE is kind of split into these 3 kind of themes. The first is climate processes of change. So this includes ice sheet modelling, which I know there's a bit of in your school. Jacinta Holloway Brown is an associate investigator in SAFE through that theme. There's also biodiversity status and trends. So Associate Professor Phil Cassie is a really strong member of that theme. That's a theme where you're trying to understand, looking at biodiversity data, understand that biodiversity data. And then the part that I am deputy lead of this theme, supporting environmental stewardship. And none of these say the word maths, right? But the big hub of maths sits within supporting environmental stewardship, because this is where we say, okay, how do we wrap all the stuff we know about the ice and the climate and the biodiversity and the change in biodiversity, how do we wrap that into models that we can start to plan stewardship, which is just a government word for management. But of course, there's little pieces of maths in both of these as well. There's a big underpinning of maths in the types of data that we do in the other ones as well. So the first thing I want to talk about in this context of Antarctica is that part of what we have to do here is model these highly uncertain systems so that we can plan their management. And Antarctica is huge. There's only small areas that there's biodiversity, but largely no one's ever been to most of Antarctica. So it's not just that we have poor data in Antarctica, it's that we have like practically no data literally no data in most places and practically no data in others. And in some places we feel like we have data, but that data is from 1923 and we can put a pin in a map, but it's not like it's geolocated data. It's someone saying like, yeah, pretty sure sometime in the past 3 years when I was on my voyage in 1923 to Antarctica, pretty sure this is where I saw that thing, right? And I'm sure it was more scientific than that, but trying to use that same data in comparison with like highly accurate data that's being collected by robots today, it's a difficult space. So we have this really sparse data. To get more, it's really expensive, infrequent visits, it's rarely repeated, and it's really biased. It can be biased data. This is my PhD student, Charlotte Patterson, who's doing her PhD looking at see if we can understand that bias. And she's doing things like saying, okay, if these are the samples of things that have ever been seen in Antarctica, when you think about 200 kilometers, it looks okay at that type of resolution. But as we get smaller and smaller in our resolution of those sampled data points, it starts to look like what it really is, which is like, no one's done anything there. We don't know anything. And when we're thinking about that the is 20 kilometers, but I'm talking about these tiny, tiny bugs and these little patches of moss, we start to realize like this, the scale of the data does not match with the scale of the things that we're asking questions about. And so one of our challenges here was to say, okay, how do we like model a system that's really complex and changing with this, like, and kind of be okay with the fact that we don't have this great data. So a PhD student, Oaks Holland, she's built this food web model. It should have been, I think, 3 times more species. For computational reasons, we had to cut it massively down. So poor data, and it's a vague approximation of what's out there, but it's better than what we had before. So we built this food web model, and this is a marine food web model. So just off the coast of Antarctica, where the nodes are approximately species or species groups, and the links are, does that guy eat that guy, approximately. And those links are really, really uncertain. And so what we're trying to do is say, if you have this really uncertain food web model, you know it kind of structurally a bit, but you don't know the strengths of those links. How the hell do we use this to then model futures? And how do we then use those models of the futures to say, well, what if it's not just the future that's happening now? What if it's the future where something is a little bit different management, or different species are coming in, like invasive species are coming through? So she's used this method called ensemble ecosystem modeling, which is basically, so we have the structure, we build the structural system of Lotka-Volterra equations, and then we acknowledge that the interaction terms are all, the interaction and the growth terms are all uncertain, but we can put logical bounds on them, and it's okay if the bounds are really massive. What we do is we draw random interaction parameters, as in hundreds of thousands of interaction parameters. We model them forward and test for stability. If the system itself is not stable, which most of them are not, we chuck it out and don't put it into our set. And what we're doing is we're building up this ensemble of randomized kind of food networks built on Lotka-Volterra relationships. So then we have what we call this like plausible set of potential ways that the system is working. And then we can ask questions about that plausible set. And it's not going to tell us exactly what happens, and it can't tell us like what probability things are going to happen, but it can tell us something about like what isn't going to happen and what do we observe happening a lot in the system. Oops, wrong computer. And so we use this system to ask, for example, can a new invasive species establish? So blue mussel is an invasive species that might come into Antarctica. So what we do is we chuck a blue mussel node into that network, do all of the sampling again. We don't require it to have stability because we're messing with the system, so there's no prior expectation of stability. But then we ask, can it actually stick around? So the x-axis here is proportion of simulations. One would be all of the time, in all of the simulations, there's been a particular outcome, and 0 is in fewer of the situations. And basically the colors are red, it establishes. So once it's there, it can stay. Blue is it kind of comes, it fails, and it dies. And the middling is kind of, it sticks around and just ticks over at low levels. And so we can say, okay, in plausible ecosystems that this might be, in plausible ways that this ecosystem works, blue mussel, I mean, it's probably not going to establish. So we can't take this and go to the Australian Antarctic Division and say, don't worry about blue mussel. But what we can say is if we do this for other species, and you as the Antarctic Division have to decide which ones to be worried about, like I just don't reckon blue mussel is the one you should focus on. So we can say things like that the Asian crab and invasive algae are ones that if you have this limited resource, limited ability to monitor for these things or manage for these things, this gives us some indication of where to put those limited resources. And then we can ask questions, and this is other work that I'm doing with Matthew Adams and another student. We can ask questions like, okay, if we have this uncertain system, and let's say we really care about predatory echinoderms, that's a green star there, that's the one we care about, then what links should we learn about? If you're able to sample the system, what links are most informative about whether these primary echinoderms are going to get kind of screwed by that blue mussel? And you would think that it's maybe the links directly from the thing you care about, or you might think it's the links directly from the blue mussel that's coming in. But in fact, what we find is sometimes just like other links that are the most informative, because those narrow down what fits in that stacked ensemble, those that ensemble of plausible ecosystem models. So it's helping us to say not just where might you manage for these things, but also where might you learn in your system to best help to best inform your management of predatory echinoderms. Then once we plan any kind of management in Antarctica, as I was saying, the management then goes through a really complex policy space for Antarctica. So this is a map that people have often seen of like territories in Antarctica, where in theory, yellow here is Australia and blue is France and green is New Zealand. But these are not really, you don't get to decide what happens on your wedge of Antarctica. This is not like, okay, let's optimize this system and let's optimize this system and tell France or Argentina what to do on their system. What actually happens is that there's 56 countries that all have some stake in Antarctic governance. These 56 countries go into a room, they send 8 people each to go into a room once a year and fight it out, or discuss things and share information. And they govern by consensus. So if Australia wants to do something, if Australia wants to protect something in our wedge, we need consensus of this really complicated policy process. And one of our questions is like, how does consensus evolve? How can consensus evolve in this 56 country governing body? So my PhD student Larissa, or a PhD student I supervise Larissa, is kind of thinking about how we can model this policy space as a social network. So like other social networks that we've seen before, nodes are countries and links have to be some kind of relationship. What we've ended up doing at the moment for this is if 2 countries have collaborated on a proposal, so they've agreed on some science and a proposal, we strengthen the link between them. So what we end up is some approximation of a social network. And then once she's done the hard work of building that social network by reading all of these documents and figuring out how everyone relates to each other, it means that we can use social network analysis or other network analysis methods to kind of try and tease apart what's happening now in the hopes we can understand what might happen in the future in that system. So what she's done is created kind of drawn out these collaboration clusters. So the countries in this cluster are more likely to collaborate than the countries in this cluster, and same across the 2 clusters, so that we can kind of understand where are these like little groups of friends, who might we rely upon or who might we definitely not rely upon if Australia is trying to bring some kind of consensus into this policy space. And so what we can do is use the structure of that social network to try and draw out stories of what these clusters are. And so, I mean, this is a preliminary analysis right now. It's definitely still in preparation. But what we're kind of seeing come out here is there's broadly, and this is current, broadly a South American group, a European group, an Asian group, and an original signatories group with a little bit of difference in between. But this is much like global geopolitics in general, not fixed. It changes over time. And there's been these big waves of change that we've been able to draw out from looking at how this social network has evolved through time. So what we've been able to do is say, okay, this is fewer countries were invested in Antarctica in the 60s and it grew over time, but so too did like the interconnectedness of the system. And so it became a bit more difficult to see these clusters. They were really clear at the beginning and it's gotten a bit, as it should have, gotten a bit denser over the time. But you can't see much just by looking at these, but the real benefit is then if she uses those to build those collaboration clusters and do that analysis one by one through these, we start to see that we can observe these clusters. And so what she's able to do is through time, so 1960s, 90, whatever it was, 90s, and now, really looking at the flow of these collaborations, which countries were together and then changed, and kind of allegiances flipped or moved. And so we're able to say things about what happened in the past. We're a little bit able to say what's kind of happening now. What are we looking at the moment? We haven't yet progressed it forward through to predictions of what might happen in the future. And what we haven't done, which I think is going to be really exciting, is comparing these types of networks in this really specific policy space focused on Antarctica. What does it look like to compare that network to like the relationships with IPCC or other places where the countries all negotiate on like nuclear or military things, or how they collaborate in other areas of science, or other kind of geopolitical machinations, trade, and kind of liking each other or hating each other. So we can try and start to see, like, is there a cause for these types of relationships, so that we can then kind of slowly start to tease out, well, what is it to understand how this complex space might actually come to an agreement on things, which is what we want and need. So I'm going to move away from Antarctica for a second. So that's the big grant that's our big Antarctic Research Centre. There's a lot of other stuff going on in that space. I'm just going to touch on another project that I've been working on. This is the work that I have been doing in my DECRA. And we're going to move from a thing that you guys do care about, because you're in Adelaide, which is Antarctica, to something you care about less, but I promise it's still good, the Great Barrier Reef. So, I mean, there's a lot of similarities when we think about complexities in these systems. So they're really big, they're largely unobservable. One, because Antarctica is very far away. Great Barrier Reef, because it's like under the water and it's hard to get information, detailed information about these things. And they're also, it's also really massive. So the Great Barrier Reef is actually so it spans almost the entire length of Queensland. And it's actually an interconnected system of like 2,000 reefs. So we do think of it as one big system, but it's this really complex interaction of different spatial clusters that are kind of linked through genetic flow of fish and coral. And apologies if you didn't already know this, I'm about to give you some bad news. Great Barrier Reef is not looking great. So it's, you know, being bombarded from multiple directions, primarily of which is climate change, and climate change is bombarding it on multiple different facets. So it is not just that the water is warming, it's that the water is becoming more acidic. It is that water quality is changing because the flow of water on land is changing, but then also how we use the land is changing, which has these impacts on the reef. So the reef is being bombarded from multiple different directions, and Australia really cares about the reef, right? Like, we rely upon it for economic purposes, tourism, for food. There's a lot of traditional owner ties into Great Barrier Reef, but there's also just like a general sense of national identity around the reef. It's a thing that Australia wants to save. And even if we stopped climate change today, even if literally today, not that it was still as bad as our projections, like literally if it stopped today, because of how the system works, there's so much like inbuilt pressure in the system that it would still continue its decline for, I can't remember the exact number, I think it's like a couple of decades the decline would continue. And we're not going to stop climate change today. And so while I wish that we would stop climate change today, there is still this gap, there's this management gap where we need to, or someone needs to do something in the meantime. We're trying to just save what we can until we can get our shit together and actually deal with the underlying pressure. And this is not the only place that this is happening, but I think it's the most compelling and urgent place where this is happening, where there are going to have to be new technological advances that we deploy in Great Barrier Reef. What we're doing, even if we do it optimally, even if we have perfected where we do what we already know how to do, it's not going to be enough. So we need new conservation technologies. Because we're pushing all of these ecosystems to the limit. This is essentially what the Great Barrier Reef looks like when it's collapsed. So we're pushing these systems to collapse. I think it's important to talk here about the difference between technology supported ecology and technologies that are designed just for conservation. So I'm not talking about like we need better drones or we need better like eDNA or ways to monitor the system and things that make our existing jobs easier. This is about like new technologies bespoke for this problem that aren't going to get developed by someone else. We can't like rely upon the market to develop these technologies because they're so specific to the problem. And new tech is really, really awesome, right? So There's so much promise in this area. You go into any engineering faculty, particularly applied ones, and you see the types of things that they're developing, you get really excited. But if you're developing technologies for a specific problem, like it is to solve this problem, it's really risky and expensive, because if it doesn't work at that one problem, then all of the money and all of the time that you invested in that research and development is wasted. And so if we're looking at the Great Barrier Reef and saying something has to be done, and we have these candidate options of what we might invest in, it then becomes an operations research and optimization problem to choose which ones of those we should be allocating our resources to. So if we think about what some of these technologies might be, and I'm not saying that these are the technologies that I think are the best, nor are they the only ones. They're the easiest ones to talk about in a talk. So we might think about some kind of lab-grown coral or DNA, some kind of DNA, imagine if I knew words. DNA, like gene editing for corals, growing hardier corals. There's approaches that are much more like kind of geotechnical, so things like cloud brightening, which is an engineering idea of basically shooting particulates into the air to build fake clouds that then shade on the really hot days. And then a much more contentious, that I think has already been slammed enough by the Career Mail that it's never going to happen and probably wasn't that good of an idea anyway, which is the idea of like, well, what if we put big fans out there and it reduced the temperature of the water? So there's ideas, right? We're not lacking ideas, we're lacking ways to choose between them. And if we're thinking about these, like the Career Mail doesn't like this and they love weird stuff. And so no one's going to ever support this. And so there's a reason we can see that might drop down our priority list. Similarly, there's issues with cloud brightening. Like, what is it going to do for the agriculture in the same areas? Is it going to work technically? There's this complex reason that these things might go up or down in our rank. And it's hard to make these decisions because before you develop them, the success of them is really highly uncertain. That's the point. You don't know what it's going to do. You don't know how effective it's going to be. And that uncertainty resolves over time as you're pouring money into it. But you have limited money to pour into it and to pour across these things. And at the same time, we're in this system where, like, the Great Barrier Reef, the reason we're doing it is because the Great Barrier Reef is declining so quickly. So we're left with these like kind of temporally evolving problems that are all happening at the same time. As time progresses, all of these different parts of the systems change, and it makes our decision problem, if we're not just looking today, but looking at that kind of sequential decision-making, really complicated. So the decisions that we might need to make in a system like this are kind of which technology should we do out of the set? Is it a better strategy to back, to spread your investment in case something doesn't work, or to back a winner? We want to know, when should we give up if something's not quite working, and when should we deploy it? When should we say, yeah, technology's ready, let's just get it out there, get something happening? We can kind of look towards pharmaceutical companies for a little bit of this, but their problems are so much less complex because they're only talking about money mostly, and they don't have like this complex system that they're trying to negotiate. So we can borrow some of it, but it's not like we can just get tools straight from the pharmaceutical literature and apply it straight into these ecosystems. The risks in this research and development planning are, first of all, the development might just not work. You've spent the money and you get nothing. Even if you're spreading your risk, there might be a critical shared failure. That means that many of your portfolio of investments don't pay off. We might have overestimated the benefits. So maybe it works, but it doesn't work as well as we thought it would. And the other is that, like, it works. It would have been great if we'd gotten it 5 years ago, but by the time it's ready, we've pushed it so far that that thing was never going to work. So we know a lot about using operations research and optimization techniques to plan conventional conservation actions. We've been doing it for about 3 decades now. Like, we know when we're asking what should we do, we know we look towards integer programming. When we know when should we do things, we know we look towards optimal stopping and scheduling problems. When we're saying where should we put things, we know it's spatial integer programming, facility location, and spatial prioritization. But what's happening here is we're starting to ask these different questions that the tools we've relied upon and that we know work and that we know how to talk to our stakeholders about are kind of not going to be sufficient for this type of problem. So some are the same, Which tech should we choose? When should we start, stop, and deploy? And when they're developed, where would we do them? Parts of the problem can be solved with that mathematics, but not all of it. So I have a student, Luz Pascal, who's I'm currently working with on a problem here where she's developing, solving this problem as a Markov decision process. So in this, Markov decision process, it's state-based optimization. So we need to know about our state. Our state is about, is our ecosystem healthy or not so healthy, and what technologies might be available and how developed are they? Are they ready to go? Are they still being developed? Our actions can be to research them or to deploy them. And we get some reward function. Costs us a bit to deploy them, but we get something if they work in the system. Costs us a bit to develop them, and we don't get anything while we're developing them. We set this up as a standard Markov decision process. So we're thinking just about state transitions in this system. The ecosystem is transitioning, so too is the state, is the technology. And so there's some state in the system, we get some reward from the state, we do some action, and things change. But the problem is, in this, maths, the problem is that the dynamics of how the state is evolving through time are highly uncertain. We don't know how well the tech is going to get developed, how well it's going to work, or how the ecosystem is changing. So there's this partial observability or kind of hidden model in the system where we can observe some things about the state, but we don't know what the underlying model is. And we still have to make the decisions in this system, acknowledging that there's this unobservability and this hidden piece of the problem. And so what we do is we're using approaches from partially observable Markov decision processes, which allows for this idea that even though it's a state-based optimization procedure, you can only see a little bit of the state. You can see it from the side, or you can see it with some uncertainty. And so instead of knowing the state, you have some belief over that state. So instead of it being state-based, it is belief-based, and the belief grows over time. You wait a year and either do something or don't do something, but you still see something and learn something. So over time, your belief or your certainty around this system, what state are you in and how will things work, resolves itself. And so then that's adding this extra temporal dynamic, right? Not only is the ecosystem declining, not only is the tech getting developed, but also your understanding of the system is changing over that time. So this is how we can stitch it together. So we use partially observable Markov decision process that are kind of built upon this idea of learning and integrating it or incorporating it via Bayes rule. And it turns us into, instead of state to action, we go to belief and action, but it has this enormous state space. So state-based optimization is already really plagued by the curse of dimensionality, but as soon as we take it into like, oh, we don't actually know what it is, let's imagine all the things it could be, then our system gets really massive. And Luz's PhD is focused on what kind of computationally efficient AI, borrowed from AI approaches, can we be using to not reduce the state space, but to deal with the size of the state space? How can we average across potential states and just consider like some kind of central point within that? So then instead of everything in the entire world, you've still got kind of discrete options for what these states might be. And so when she performs her optimization in this small problem, the optimal solution is kind of, first of all, to monitor, then we learn a bit, you get some recommendation, and it is to research and develop this particular or both technologies at the same time, let's say. Then we act, we monitor, we learn, make a new recommendation. So the next year in this sequential process, you recommend then, oh, actually, this technology is ready, let's send it out. So it's this kind of iterative learning system that allows us to make these sequential decisions in this context of so many things changing through time. And so we get to, these kind of simulated, optimized procedures for this very small problem. You've got two technologies and either the ecosystem's healthy or it's not healthy. In this small problem, the method does really well. So here the green is the time, the amount of simulated scenarios that this method works better than if you weren't modeling it, acknowledging the partial observability. And yeah, and 30% of the time, the system happened to be that like your best choice was just to do one thing or do nothing. And so sometimes the less complex system, the less complex method works better. But overall, this is what we want to see, right? For a method we want to start using and trusting and developing, it's good to see that it works better some of the time, but it's a tiny problem. And so now what we need to do is say, okay, we're going to answer this tiny problem. We have a method to tackle the massive complexity of this small problem, but the Great Barrier Reef is 2,000 connected reefs. And there's many more options of what we might be able to do in that system. So now our challenge is to take this small piece that we know works well and scale that up. So this is kind of getting towards the end of my talk, and I guess my end messaging here is that there are these big environmental problems that are looming. We know they're looming, society knows they're looming, scientists know they're looming. And maths can't, I'm not saying that maths can solve the problems alone. Like my team is not about, I'm just going to develop these methods and hand them off. We work really heavily with the science and policy people, and we can't solve anything without them. But it's becoming increasingly apparent that like we are a really critical piece of that puzzle as well. And I lead a group that is really focused on these types of problems, but that doesn't mean that there's not like a ton of room or need for mathematicians and data scientists across many different fields to like find the piece here and say like, oh, the thing that I already knew how to do in another system could be adapted for this. And so, you know, I guess I encourage people to join us in developing methods and formulating old ones to fill these gaps. And I guess I'll just remind you guys that Adelaide has a node for the SAFE, you know, it's a $36 million centre. A lot of that is spent in sending people to Antarctica. It's hard to get sent as a mathematician. But what it does mean is that it's really easy to get involved in these big centres if your university is already in the club. And so I guess I'm just reminding you that Jacinta Holloway-Brown is already part of, you know, she came here, she wasn't originally part of SAFE, she's found a spot and joined it. Phil Cassie, big shot laureate now in your university, he's involved as well. And so I guess just encourage you to really think about whether there are pieces here that might be of interest to you or places where you might find yourself. So that's my research group. We're cool. If you come to Brisbane, come and visit us. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Okay.
Thinking about the looming trend.
Looming test of the Great Barrier Reef. Yeah. Not the Great Barrier Reef, because of the good.
I have a question. Because towards the end, you were talking about thinking about if there's something in your work that can translate to one of these other systems. Yeah. Do you see much possibility for that between the work even your group is doing in, like, say, Antarctica and the reef, or are they really like the differences in the system so vast that they're not really going to be transferable?
A lot of similarities, just because how different the complexity of ecosystems are compared to deterministic systems that we know a lot about. The huge gap between the difference between those two things, you know, makes the difference between Antarctica and the Great Barrier Reef quite minuscule when we're thinking about it from a maths and data science perspective, because what we think about are complexities and uncertainties and changes over time, right? And so for us, I think the types of tools and techniques we used in one or the other are really, really close. And so I think if you were looking for a way to figure out how your maths might be useful in these types of problems, I wouldn't say like tomorrow you'd be like, the Great Barrier Reef, that's the thing that I can work on. And it's like, oh, shit, the types of problems in these, like it's the same types of problems I think about when I think about, you know, other social network systems or other kind of spatial remote sense systems. And it's okay not to know like the exact piece of the puzzle that you're going to solve, because there's this huge number of people, there's huge people in the applied sciences, but also in mathematics who think really hard about the gaps here. And so conversations, I think, can really help to resolve like the idea of how your stuff might be useful in those types of systems.
Building on that kind of, you know, when you're solving these problems with all of their complexities of partially observed Markov decision processes and things, and you know all the assumptions and things and all the badness in that. How do you know what and how to communicate these very technical results to policymakers?
So particularly with the POMDP example, I think it's a really good question, because I think that the idea of partially observable Markov decision processes and what the solutions look like can be bamboozling even for people who work in MDPs in other circumstances. And that's not helpful. Like finding an optimal solution that you cannot communicate to someone is as unhelpful as having no optimal solution. And so there's fields of study, particularly in the POMDP space, about developing interpretable policies. So we go all of the way to developing the full solution, and then we walk it back. So we think, what can we sacrifice from that perfect solution? Because in these systems, in this complex policy space, your perfect optimal solution will simply never be deployed anyway. Something will happen at some point, it'll be slightly changed. So I think in mathematics, we often try and say like, well, this is the optimal, right? I'm the top of the apex here, and I don't want to make a sacrifice in any direction, because I might push myself into, you know, some kind of local minima that's right next to the local maxima. But the fact is, it's going to happen in these systems anyway. And so in the name of interpretability, we can just say like, it's going to happen anyway, let's just step back from it and sacrifice like marginal bits of, or even large bits of optimality, so that something is happening. So someone will understand the policy. Yeah.
How important is it that you and your group sort of personally are trusted by policy, and you have a reputation and relationships?
Well, sort of not important at all, or it's as important as we decide to make it. So someone has to be trusted. Someone in the mathematical community needs to be trusted, because someone needs to know who to go to and who to take these to. But every single person doesn't have to be doing, you know, solving the interpretable thing, and doesn't have to be knowing exactly how to communicate this to stakeholders or to non-mathematicians. Everyone doesn't have to be trusted. But what we need to do is, like, as a field, be trusted. And so we have decided to make it important in our group to build the relationships, because the relationships help us to refine our questions. And it has turned out that those relationships are part of how you get trusted. But we did it because we wanted the maths to be better and more accurate. So, yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Thanks for a great talk. So sorry, this is quite specific. So like on that network or in like predator-prey relations,
yeah.
So you were describing a method that is able to identify relevance of a particular edge or the particular inference. Could you say a little bit more about that, and how does that relate to the local Volterra system?
Yeah, so you know how I said we have these set of interaction parameters, and we chuck out ones that don't reach stability. What we do is we divide up the potential space. So instead of just evenly dividing that that range that they all could be, we're like a little bit more careful about how we divide up that space, and we bin all of our, instead of just having our stacked ensembles in the ensemble, we put those into those categories of the thing that the links that we're asking about. So we ask about one link at a time. We're not looking at like learning about all the links at the same time. We say, what if you could only explore one? And so then we look more deeply into the range that link might take. And then we assess how accurately we were able to detect changes in the thing that we cared about. It's a half-written paper right now. Yeah.
It's interesting. It's kind of like edge relevance method.
Yeah.
Constructing.
I actually haven't thought about it in that way. We were kind of looking at kind of from a kind of a Bayesian inference angle, but you're right that we could look into learning about in other network systems. Yeah. Edge relevance, is that what you said? Yeah.
Okay. No other questions, and let's thank Kate once again for thank you.
Is there any online?
I didn't see any online. Yeah, so they're welcome to ask.
Oh, I forgot about the angle on that camera.